Hello. Tonight, you step into the cold stone heart of the medieval world, a place not of fairy tale romance, but of unrelenting, grinding discomfort. Before starting this video, which is only for you, relaxing and helping you sleep by clearing your mind, it would be a great support to us if you wrote where and when you watched it in the comments and subscribed. The fundamental and inescapable reality of life within a medieval castle, a reality that governed every aspect of daily existence from the moment of waking to the moment of sleep, was dictated by the very material from which the structure was made, stone. This choice of material was not one of comfort or aesthetics but of absolute military and political necessity, a response to a world in which the projection of power and the security of one's person and property were the paramount concerns. The great stone keeps and curtain walls that have come to define the medieval period were, first and foremost, instruments of war and statements of permanence, their massive, thick-walled construction designed to withstand the siege technologies of the age, from the battering ram to the trebuchet, and to provide a secure and defensible base of operations from which a lord could control the surrounding territory. The stone was chosen for its durability, its resistance to fire, and its sheer, intimidating mass, qualities that made it the supreme defensive material of its time. However, these very same qualities that made stone an ideal material for fortification also rendered it a profoundly hostile material for human habitation, creating an internal environment that was perpetually cold, relentlessly damp, and shrouded in a near-constant gloom. Stone possesses a high thermal mass, a physical property that means it is exceptionally slow to absorb and release heat, and in the cool, damp climates that prevailed over much of medieval Europe, this characteristic transformed the castle into a massive and brutally efficient thermal sink. The stone walls, often many feet thick, would absorb the cold from the surrounding environment, and once chilled, they would retain that cold for extraordinarily long periods, radiating it back into the interior spaces day and night, summer and winter. The feeble and inefficient heating methods available at the time, primarily open hearths located in the center of rooms or, in later and more sophisticated designs, large fireplaces built into the walls, were woefully inadequate to combat this pervasive, bone-deep chill. The heat from these fires would rise and quickly dissipate through the high, uninsulated ceilings or be drawn out through the unglazed window openings, while the great mass of the surrounding stonework remained largely unaffected, its cold presence a constant and oppressive fact of life for the inhabitants. This inherent coldness was compounded by a second and equally persistent environmental problem: dampness. The stone from which the castles were constructed was porous, and the mortar used to bind the stones together was even more so, a combination that allowed moisture from the rain-saturated exterior and the surrounding ground to slowly and inexorably seep through the massive walls. This process of water ingress created a state of perpetual humidity within the castle's rooms, a condition that was exacerbated by the poor ventilation and the condensation that would form as the warm, moist air from human breath and cooking fires came into contact with the cold surfaces of the stone walls. The result was an environment where a slick, cold film of moisture was an almost permanent feature on the interior stone surfaces, and where the air itself felt heavy and wet. This pervasive dampness fostered the growth of mold and mildew, which would have been a constant presence on the walls, in the woolen textiles used for clothing and bedding, and on the rushes that were strewn on the floor, contributing to a characteristic and inescapable musty odor that permeated every corner of the structure. The combination of this relentless cold and damp created an environment that was not only profoundly uncomfortable but also deeply unhealthy, contributing to a host of chronic ailments such as rheumatism, arthritis, and respiratory infections, conditions that were simply accepted as a normal and unavoidable part of life. The experience of living within these stone walls was therefore one of constant, low-grade physical stress, a continuous battle against an environment that seemed actively hostile to the warmth and dryness that are essential for human comfort and well-being. The very structure that provided a knight with his security from the outside world was also a relentless and inescapable source of physical misery, a cold and damp reality that was the silent, unwritten context for every moment of his life within its walls. The internal space of the castle was not organized according to principles of personal comfort or privacy, but was instead a rigid and highly legible map of the social hierarchy, a physical manifestation of the complex web of duty, obligation, and status that defined the feudal world. The allocation of space and the degree of access one had to the limited sources of warmth and light was a direct and constant reflection of one's position within the intricate pyramid of the castle household. At the very center of this social and spatial universe was the Great Hall, a vast, high-ceilinged and multi-purpose chamber that served as the primary communal space for all but the very lowest-ranking inhabitants of the castle. This single room was the functional heart of the entire fortress, a place that simultaneously served as the Lord's courtroom, his administrative center, his dining room, and for a significant portion of its residents, their primary and often only living and sleeping space. The sheer scale of the Great Hall was intended to be impressive, a theatrical backdrop for the performance of lordship, with its high timber-beamed ceiling, its large, often unglazed windows, and its massive central hearth or imposing wall fireplace. It was here that the lord and his family would conduct the business of their domain, receiving petitions from their tenants, dispensing justice, and entertaining important visitors, their authority reinforced by their elevated position on a raised dais at one end of the hall. The daily ritual of the communal meal also took place in this space, a highly choreographed event where the seating arrangements meticulously reflected the status of each individual, with the lord, his family, and his most honored guests seated at the high table, while the knights, squires, men-at-arms, and higher-ranking servants were arranged on long trestle tables in the main body of the hall, their proximity to the lord a clear and public indicator of their importance. For the vast majority of the castle's knightly and martial population, however, the Great Hall was not just a place of work and social ritual, it was also their home. The concept of a personal, private living space was a luxury that was almost entirely unknown to them. After the evening meal was concluded and the trestle tables were cleared away, the floor of the hall was transformed into a communal dormitory. The residents would unroll their sleeping pallets, which consisted of simple canvas sacks stuffed with straw or horsehair, and lay them out on the rush-covered stone floor, often in close proximity to the still smoldering embers of the central hearth, which offered the only source of warmth through the long, cold night. The conditions in this makeshift dormitory were devoid of any semblance of privacy or modern comfort. The men slept fully clothed, huddled together for warmth, their bodies arranged in a dense and often disorderly mass on the floor. The space would have been filled with the sounds of a large group of people sleeping, snoring, coughing, and shifting in their slumber, and the air would have been thick with the smells of unwashed bodies, stale food, and the ever-present wood smoke from the hearth. The rushes that covered the floor, which were intended to provide a layer of insulation and to absorb the spills and refuse of the day, were only changed infrequently, and they quickly became a foul and unsanitary mattress of dirt, discarded food scraps, and animal waste from the dogs that were a constant presence in the hall, a condition that created an ideal breeding ground for vermin and disease. The only escape from this complete lack of privacy and this constant low-level sensory assault was a small degree of spatial privilege that might be afforded to the most senior knights, who might be granted the right to sleep in a slightly less crowded corner of the hall or in a small, unheated alcove or wall chamber. The ultimate symbol of status and the only true pocket of privacy within the entire keep was the solar, a private chamber or suite of chambers, that was reserved for the lord and his immediate family, a space that was typically located on an upper floor, often directly above the Great Hall, and which might have its own fireplace and a private latrine. The existence of this single, isolated zone of relative comfort and seclusion served only to highlight, by its stark contrast, the profoundly public, communal, and uncomfortable reality that defined the daily existence of the knights and retainers who lived and slept on the cold stone floor below. The absence of personal space and the profoundly communal nature of life in the Great Hall were conditions that extended into every aspect of a knight's daily routine, including the most basic and personal matters of hygiene and sanitation, which were governed by a set of practices that ranged from the rudimentary to the actively unsanitary. The very floor upon which the knights and retainers slept was a key component in a system of waste disposal that was fundamentally one of slow, managed accumulation. The rushes, which were periodically laid down in thick layers over the stone flags, were not merely a form of insulation or primitive carpeting, but were an organic medium intended to absorb the constant debris of daily life. Into this ever-thickening mat would fall spilled food and drink from the trestle tables, bones gnawed clean and tossed to the dogs or simply dropped on the floor, and the dirt and mud that was constantly tracked in from the outside. This created an environment that, while perhaps tolerable to the medieval sensibility, was by any modern standard a deeply unhygienic one, a composting layer of organic refuse that would have been a fertile breeding ground for bacteria, insects, and the vermin that were a constant and accepted feature of castle life. The concept of personal cleanliness was similarly circumscribed by the limitations of the available technology and the prevailing cultural norms. While the lord and his lady, in the privacy of their solar, might have enjoyed the relative luxury of a wooden bathtub, which would be laboriously filled with water heated over a fire, such a convenience was an impossibility for the lower-ranking members of the household. Their ablutions were typically performed in a more public and cursory fashion, often consisting of a quick wash of the hands and face with cold water from a basin or a communal trough located in the castle courtyard. Soap, a simple but effective cleaning agent made from a combination of animal fat and wood ash, was available, but it was a relatively valuable commodity and its use was likely to have been sparing. The more significant and architecturally distinct solution to the problem of human waste was the garderobe, the medieval equivalent of the toilet, a feature that, while representing a significant technological advance over a simple chamber pot, was itself a source of profound and unavoidable discomfort and foulness. A garderobe was typically a small, unheated stone room or closet, often built into the thickness of the outer castle wall, containing a simple wooden or stone seat with a hole in it. This hole opened directly into a vertical chute that descended down the face of the castle wall, allowing the waste to fall, by the simple force of gravity, into the moat below or into a dedicated cesspit at the base of the fortress. The design of the garderobe was a pragmatic and often ingenious solution to the problem of removing waste from the interior of the keep, and its placement was often a matter of strategic military consideration, with the chutes being located on sheer, difficult-to-climb sections of the wall to prevent them from becoming a potential access point for enemy attackers during a siege. For the user, however, the experience of the garderobe was one of almost unimaginable discomfort. The small, unheated stone chamber was often located at the end of a short and narrow corridor, and it was perpetually subject to a strong and chilling draft, as the open chute acted as a highly effective conduit for the wind, which would whistle up from below, bringing with it not only the cold air of the outside but also the foul stench from the accumulated waste in the moat or cesspit. The smell within and around the garderobe would have been a constant and overwhelming presence, a pungent and unavoidable feature of the castle's sensory landscape. The task of cleaning these chutes and of emptying the cesspits when they became full was a specialized and highly undesirable occupation, performed by individuals known as gong farmers, who were required to work at night to minimize the offense to the castle's other inhabitants, their labor a stark and necessary reminder of the grim logistical realities that underpinned the seemingly grand and noble edifice. This system, which dealt with only one specific form of waste, was part of a broader environmental context in which the disposal of all refuse, from the wastewater of the kitchens to the animal manure from the stables and the bailey, was a constant and largely unresolved problem, turning the castle moat into a stagnant, open sewer and the surrounding grounds into a landscape that was saturated with the accumulated filth of a large and permanently resident population. The diet that sustained the inhabitants of the castle, from the lord to the lowest-ranking man-at-arms, was a direct reflection of the fortress's primary military function as a defensible and self-sufficient economic unit, a nutritional regimen that was designed not for pleasure or for optimal health, but for long-term storage, caloric efficiency, and the ability to withstand a prolonged siege. The popular image of the medieval castle as a place of constant, joyous feasting, with tables groaning under the weight of roasted swans and suckling pigs, is a dramatic distortion of a much more monotonous and challenging reality. Such feasts were rare and highly significant political and social events, staged to mark a major religious festival, a wedding, or a visit from an important dignitary, and they were not in any way representative of the daily fare. The everyday diet was a profoundly repetitive and limited one, dictated by the seasonal availability of fresh produce and, more importantly, by the technologies of food preservation, which were effective in preventing starvation but which rendered the food into a state that was often unpalatable, texturally challenging, and nutritionally compromised. The logistical imperative of provisioning a large, non-agricultural population within the castle walls meant that a significant portion of the surrounding estate's agricultural output was funneled into the castle's storerooms, the larder and the buttery, where it was processed for long-term survival. The single most important food item, the absolute foundation of the diet for every social class, was bread. This was not the light, airy loaf of modern times, but a dense, coarse and heavy bread, baked from a mixture of wheat and rye flour known as maslin, which was dark in color and would have been the primary source of carbohydrates and calories for the average person. The other pillar of the daily diet was a dish known as pottage, a thick, slow-cooked stew or porridge that was in a state of almost constant preparation in a great iron cauldron suspended over a fire in the castle's kitchens. The base of the pottage was typically a cereal grain, such as oats or barley, which was boiled with whatever vegetables were available from the castle's gardens or the surrounding fields, such as onions, leeks, cabbages, and peas. Into this thick, soupy mixture might be added a small quantity of meat or fish to provide flavor and a modest amount of protein, but for the most part, it was a simple, starchy, and unvarying dish that was consumed day after day, year after year. The primary source of protein for the non-elite members of the household came not from fresh roasts, but from meat and fish that had been subjected to the harsh but necessary processes of preservation. Great quantities of beef, pork, and mutton were preserved through heavy salting, a process that involved packing the meat in barrels of salt, which drew out the moisture and created an environment that was hostile to the bacteria that caused decay. Fish, particularly cod and herring, which were harvested in vast numbers from the seas, were preserved either by salting or by a process of wind-drying and smoking until they were as hard and durable as a piece of wood. These preservation methods, while effective, fundamentally altered the nature of the food, turning the meat into a tough, leathery, and intensely salty substance that was often barely recognizable as its fresh counterpart, and which typically required a long period of soaking in water before it was even remotely edible. This overwhelming reliance on salted foods, combined with a near-total absence of fresh fruits and vegetables for long periods of the year, particularly during the winter, created a diet that was dangerously deficient in essential vitamins, most notably vitamin C, leading to the chronic and debilitating effects of scurvy, with its symptoms of lethargy, joint pain, and bleeding gums, a condition that would have been a common and accepted affliction of castle life. This constant, monotonous, and nutritionally impoverished diet was another of the great unwritten hardships of the knight's existence, a daily assault on the palate and a slow, cumulative assault on the body that was simply the price of survival within the stone walls of the fortress. The acquisition and management of the two most critical and non-negotiable resources for the castle's survival, water and fuel, were logistical undertakings of immense scale and profound strategic importance, daily and seasonal challenges that dictated the very location of the fortress and shaped the rhythm of its internal and external economies. The popular conception of a castle as an entirely self-sufficient and isolated entity is a misleading one, as even the most formidable fortress was deeply and inextricably linked to the surrounding landscape, its long-term viability absolutely dependent on its ability to control and exploit the natural resources of its immediate environment. The provision of a secure and reliable source of fresh water was the single most critical factor in determining the defensibility and long-term habitability of the site, a consideration that often took precedence over other tactical advantages. The ideal and most secure solution was the construction of a well within the protective confines of the castle's curtain walls, a feat of engineering that was often one of the most difficult, expensive, and time-consuming aspects of the entire building process. The digging of a castle well was a monumental task, requiring a team of specialized laborers to excavate a deep, vertical shaft through many feet of solid earth and, in many cases, solid rock, a slow and dangerous process that was carried out with the most rudimentary of hand tools. The depths of these wells could be extraordinary, sometimes extending hundreds of feet below the surface to reach the water table, and their construction was a testament to the profound and almost obsessive importance that was placed on securing an internal water supply that could not be cut off or poisoned by a besieging enemy. The water from this well, raised to the surface by the laborious, repetitive process of hauling a bucket on a rope or, in more advanced systems, by a wooden windlass, was the lifeblood of the castle, providing the water needed for drinking, cooking, and the brewing of the weak, low-alcohol ale that was a staple of the daily diet and often safer to consume than the untreated water itself. While the well provided for the daily needs of the household, the other essential resource, fuel in the form of firewood, represented a constant and significant logistical challenge, as it could not be stored within the castle in quantities sufficient to last through a long winter or a prolonged siege. The demand for firewood was enormous and unrelenting, as it was the sole energy source for the heating of the great hall and the solar, for the cooking of all the food in the great kitchens, and for the operation of the forges in the smithy where the castle's tools and weapons were repaired and maintained. To meet this immense demand, the castle depended on its legal and customary right to exploit the surrounding woodlands, a right known as wood right, which allowed the lord's tenants and servants to harvest timber from the forests of his domain. The gathering of this fuel was a major seasonal activity, a vast and highly organized enterprise that took place primarily in the autumn, after the agricultural harvest was complete. Large teams of laborers, known as woodcutters, would venture into the forests, often several miles from the castle, to fell trees and to chop and split the timber into manageable logs. This wood was then loaded onto carts and wagons and hauled back to the castle in long, slow-moving convoys, a process that was itself a significant expenditure of animal and human labor. This reliance on an external and geographically dispersed resource created a significant strategic vulnerability, as an enemy force could easily interdict these supply lines, cutting the castle off from its primary source of heat and energy, a tactic that was a common and effective feature of siege warfare. The management of the woodlands themselves was a critical aspect of the lord's administrative responsibilities, requiring a careful and long-term approach to forestry that balanced the immediate need for fuel with the long-term health and sustainability of the forest, a system that often involved the coppicing and pollarding of trees to ensure a continuous and renewable supply of wood. The ever-present smoke that rose from the castle's chimneys and smoke holes was a constant and visible reminder of this profound and non-negotiable dependence on the surrounding landscape, a fragile umbilical cord of energy that tied the great stone fortress to the living organic world beyond its walls. The internal environment of the castle, with its pervasive cold, damp, and poor sanitation, was a landscape that was shared not only by its human inhabitants but also by a vast and varied population of non-human creatures, a complex and largely unwelcome ecosystem of vermin, insects, and parasites that thrived in the unique conditions created by the fortress and its residents. The relationship between the human and animal occupants of the castle was a constant and intimate one, a daily struggle against a host of small, persistent adversaries that was an accepted and largely unavoidable feature of medieval life. The most visible and perhaps least troublesome of these cohabitants were the birds, such as pigeons and jackdaws, that would nest in the high, inaccessible crenellations of the battlements and in the timber scaffolding of the roofs, their constant cooing and chattering a familiar part of the castle's soundscape. More problematic were the ubiquitous rats and mice, which were a constant and formidable presence in every part of the castle, from the deepest dungeons to the lord's own solar. The castle's extensive network of storerooms, with their vast quantities of grain, flour, and preserved meats, represented an almost inexhaustible source of food for these rodents, and their populations could grow to enormous numbers, creating a significant and constant threat to the household's food security. A substantial portion of the grain stored in the granaries was inevitably lost to the depredations of these creatures, a loss that was simply factored into the brutal calculus of the castle's annual provisioning. The presence of this large rodent population also created a significant public health risk, as the fleas that infested the rats were the primary vectors for the transmission of devastating epidemic diseases, most notably the bubonic plague, a connection that was not understood at the time but which made the castle a particularly vulnerable environment during periods of widespread pestilence. The fight against this rodent infestation was a constant and largely ineffective one, waged with a variety of low-technology methods. The castle household would have included a significant population of cats, which were not kept as pampered pets but as working animals, their primary function being the hunting of mice and rats in the storerooms and kitchens. The effectiveness of these feline predators was supplemented by the use of simple mechanical traps, such as deadfalls and snares, which would have been set in the evenings and checked each morning. The rushes that covered the floors of the Great Hall and other living spaces provided another ideal habitat, not only for mice but for a host of smaller and more intimate pests. This damp, organic matting was a thriving ecosystem for insects such as fleas, lice, and beetles, and the human inhabitants of the castle, who slept upon these very rushes, were in a state of constant and unavoidable contact with this parasitic population. Personal hygiene, which was already rudimentary, was further complicated by the constant presence of these creatures. An infestation with body lice was not a sign of personal failing or uncleanliness but was a near-universal and accepted condition of life, affecting the lord in his solar as much as the squire on the floor of the hall. The use of fine-toothed combs, which were commonly made from bone or antler and are a frequent find in archaeological excavations of castle sites, was not a matter of vanity but a necessary and daily tool for the physical removal of these parasites from the hair. The bedding, which was made from straw-filled mattresses and woolen blankets, was another haven for these pests, and the constant itching and irritation from their bites would have been a familiar and inescapable nightly torment. This intimate and unwilling symbiosis with a world of vermin and parasites was another of the great, unwritten sensory hardships of castle life, a constant, low-level physical assault that was simply another part of the tapestry of discomfort that defined the medieval domestic experience. The system of artificial lighting available within the castle was profoundly limited, a scarce and carefully managed resource that plunged the vast interior spaces of the fortress into a deep and pervasive gloom for almost half of every 24-hour cycle, a condition that fundamentally shaped the rhythm and the nature of the inhabitants' daily lives. The coming of nightfall was not a gentle transition into a world of illuminated leisure, but was a rapid and almost total surrender to a darkness that was barely held at bay by the feeble and flickering light of the most primitive of technologies. The primary and most widespread source of light, particularly in the communal spaces like the Great Hall and the kitchens, was the open fire of the hearth itself. While this provided a significant amount of warmth, its utility as a source of illumination was surprisingly limited, casting a bright and cheerful glow on the area immediately surrounding the hearth but leaving the far corners of the large, high-ceilinged rooms in a deep and almost impenetrable shadow. The light from the fire was also of a low and inconsistent quality, a constantly shifting and dancing light that made any task requiring fine visual detail, such as reading or sewing, exceptionally difficult. Away from the central hearth, in the myriad of smaller chambers, corridors, and spiral staircases that honeycombed the massive stone structure, the darkness was nearly absolute, a thick and palpable blackness that was navigated more by memory and touch than by sight. The uneven stone floors and the winding, narrow stairwells, which were a challenge to traverse even in daylight, became treacherous and potentially lethal obstacles in the dark, and movement through the castle at night was a slow, cautious, and often hazardous undertaking. To supplement the light of the fire, the inhabitants relied on a small and expensive arsenal of portable and fixed lighting devices, the use of which was strictly rationed and allocated according to the same rigid social hierarchy that governed all other aspects of castle life. The most common and economical form of artificial light was the rushlight, a simple and homemade device created by soaking the dried pith of the common rush plant in a container of melted animal fat or grease. Once the fat had cooled and solidified, the rush could be lit, where it would smolder slowly, producing a dim, smoky, and foul-smelling light for a short period, typically no more than 15 or 20 minutes before being consumed. These rushlights were the primary source of portable light for the lower-ranking members of the household, used to briefly illuminate a specific task or to light the way on a short journey from the hall to a sleeping alcove. A more durable and slightly brighter, though significantly more expensive, source of light was the tallow candle. These were made from rendered animal fat, typically from beef or mutton, which was repeatedly dipped around a flaxen or cotton wick to build up a thick, greasy cylinder. The light produced by a tallow candle was superior to that of a rushlight, but it was also smoky, produced a deeply unpleasant, acrid odor as it burned, and had a tendency to gutter and drip hot grease, making it a messy and somewhat hazardous light source. The use of tallow candles was a privilege, likely reserved for the high table in the Great Hall and for the more important administrative offices of the castle. The absolute pinnacle of lighting technology and a symbol of immense wealth and status was the beeswax candle. Beeswax, a byproduct of honey production, was a far scarcer and more costly material than animal fat, and the candles it produced were superior in every way, burning with a bright, clean and steady flame and producing a faint, pleasant, honey-like scent. The use of beeswax candles was an exclusive prerogative of the highest echelons of society, their clear, pure light illuminating the private chambers of the lord and his family and the sacred space of the castle's chapel, their very presence a conspicuous and unmistakable statement of power and prestige. The immense cost and scarcity of these light sources meant that the castle's inhabitants spent the majority of their non-working hours in a state of near total darkness, a condition that profoundly influenced the social and psychological landscape of the night, turning it into a long, quiet and largely inactive period of enforced rest and confinement. The auditory environment of the castle was a complex and constantly shifting soundscape, a rich and often overwhelming tapestry of noises that, like the allocation of light and space, was a direct reflection of the fortress's dual and often contradictory functions as a military installation and a complex domestic household. The most fundamental and ever-present sound, the acoustic bedrock upon which all others were layered, was the sound of the wind. The castle, by its very nature, was typically situated in a high, exposed and militarily defensible position, a location that made it a natural focal point for the prevailing winds, which would sweep across the landscape and break against the massive stone walls. This interaction between the wind and the complex architecture of the fortress produced a vast and varied symphony of sound, from a low, almost subaudible moan that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves, to a high-pitched, shrieking whistle as the wind was funneled through the narrow arrow slits of the battlements and the unglazed tracery of the chapel windows. During a storm, the sound of the wind could rise to a deafening and terrifying roar, a constant and oppressive barrage of noise that made conversation impossible and sleep a difficult achievement. Woven into this constant background of the wind were the sounds generated by the human and animal inhabitants of the castle, a cacophony that was at its most intense during the daylight hours and which was centered on the two great hubs of castle life, the bailey and the Great Hall. The bailey, the large, open courtyard that was enclosed by the outer curtain wall, was the primary industrial and logistical center of the fortress, and from dawn until dusk it was filled with a continuous and deafening chorus of labor. The rhythmic, metallic clang of the blacksmith's hammer on the anvil, the grating sound of the grindstone sharpening an axe or a plowshare, the splintering crash of an axe splitting logs for firewood, the lowing of cattle and the bleating of sheep in their pens, the barking of dogs, the shouting of orders, and the creak and groan of the heavy wooden wheels of a cart on the packed earth of the yard all combined to create a powerful and unceasing symphony of work. Inside the keep, the Great Hall was the epicenter of the human soundscape. During the day, the cavernous, stone-walled chamber, with its high-beamed ceiling, would have acted as a massive echo chamber, amplifying every sound into a booming and indistinct roar. The hard, stone surfaces of the walls and floor, which were bare of any sound-absorbing materials like carpets or tapestries, would have caused every footstep, every cough, and every spoken word to reverberate and linger in the air, creating a constant, low-level din that made quiet conversation a near impossibility. The daily communal meals in this space would have been incredibly noisy affairs, with the clatter of hundreds of wooden trenchers and pewter cups on the trestle tables, the loud and often boisterous talk of the diners, the sounds of the dogs fighting for scraps under the tables, and on festive occasions the loud and often competing sounds of the musicians, such as a minstrel playing a harp or a bagpipe, who might be performing from a gallery at one end of the hall. The acoustic environment of the castle was therefore one of dramatic and often jarring contrasts. The bailey and the Great Hall were places of near constant and overwhelming noise, spaces where the very possibility of quiet contemplation or private conversation was effectively non-existent. In stark contrast, the smaller, more isolated chambers and the labyrinthine network of stone corridors and stairwells were places of a deep and almost unnerving silence, a quiet that was broken only by the sound of one's own footsteps echoing on the stone and the ever-present, mournful sound of the wind. This acoustic world, with its extremes of chaotic noise and profound silence, was another of the great unwritten sensory challenges of castle life, an environment that offered its inhabitants little respite from either the clamor of the community or the deep and isolating quiet of the stone. The social structure of the castle household was a rigid and minutely gradated hierarchy, a complex pyramid of status and obligation in which every individual, from the lord at its apex to the most menial servant at its base, occupied a precise and clearly defined position. This was not a society of fluid social mobility or individualistic ambition, but was a deeply corporate and interdependent world, a human ecosystem in which each person's rights, duties, and even their physical location within the castle were determined by their relationship to the lord and their functional role within the larger organism of the household. At the pinnacle of this structure was the lord himself, the master of the castle and the surrounding domain, a figure whose personal authority was, in theory, almost absolute within his own sphere of influence. He was the primary military commander, the chief administrator, and the ultimate judicial authority for all the inhabitants of his lands, his power a combination of inherited right, military prowess, and the complex network of personal loyalties he was able to command. Immediately below him in status were the members of his immediate family: his wife, the lady of the castle, and his children. The lady, while subordinate to her husband, was a powerful and influential figure in her own right, the mistress of the domestic household and the individual responsible for the complex and demanding task of managing the internal economy of the castle, overseeing the food supplies, the production of textiles, and the supervision of the vast army of indoor servants. The next and most significant tier of the hierarchy was occupied by the knightly class, the professional, mounted warriors whose primary function was to provide for the military security of the lord's domain. These were not a uniform group, but were themselves subdivided into a range of statuses. The most senior and trusted of these were the household knights, a permanent residential cadre of warriors who lived in the castle year-round, serving as the lord's personal bodyguard, his council of military advisors, and the officers of his garrison. Below them were the knights of the fief, individuals who held land from the lord in exchange for a specified period of military service, typically 40 days a year, and who would reside in the castle only during their period of service or in times of war. This martial class also included the squires, the young men of noble birth who were in the final stages of their training for knighthood, serving as the personal assistants to the household knights, waiting on them at table, caring for their armor and their horses, and accompanying them into battle. Supporting this elite warrior class was a larger and more diverse group of professional men-at-arms and archers, the non-knightly but essential soldiers who formed the bulk of the castle's garrison, and who were responsible for the daily and monotonous duties of standing guard on the battlements, operating the gatehouse, and maintaining the castle's extensive arsenal of military equipment. Below this entire martial superstructure was the vast and complex world of the castle's domestic and administrative staff, a hierarchy that was a perfect mirror of the military one. The great officers of the household, such as the steward, who was the lord's chief administrator and was responsible for the overall management of the estate, the marshal, who was in charge of the stables and all matters relating to the horses, and the chamberlain, who was responsible for the finances and the lord's private chambers, were often men of high birth and considerable power. Beneath them was a descending cascade of more specialized and lower-ranking servants, from the clerks and scribes who maintained the estate's written records, to the master craftsmen like the blacksmith and the carpenter, down to the army of menial servants who performed the endless, back-breaking labor of the kitchens, the laundry, and the stables, the cooks, the scullions, the grooms, and the gong farmers. At the very bottom of this entire structure were the unfree serfs, the agricultural laborers who were legally bound to the lord's land and who, while not permanent residents of the castle itself, formed the broad and essential economic foundation upon which the entire edifice of feudal power was built. This intricate and unyielding social order was a constant and visible reality of castle life, a world in which one's place was known, one's duties were clear, and the boundaries between the different strata of the pyramid were almost impossible to cross. The life of a knight within this rigid hierarchical structure was one that was governed by a demanding and almost monastic routine, a daily and seasonal cycle of activities that was designed to maintain his physical conditioning, to hone his martial skills, and to reinforce his social and moral obligations to his lord and to the chivalric code. The popular image of the knight as a free-roaming adventurer engaged in a constant series of romantic quests is a profound misunderstanding of a life that was, for the most part, a highly disciplined, deeply monotonous, and often profoundly boring existence, punctuated by brief and brutal episodes of intense violence. The knight's day began at dawn, with the ringing of a bell from the castle chapel summoning the household to the first religious service of the day, a mass that attendance that was a mandatory and non-negotiable part of the daily schedule for all but the lowest-ranking servants. Following this, the knight would break his fast with a simple and Spartan meal, often consisting of bread and ale, before embarking on the first and most important business of his day, the training and maintenance of his martial skills. The primary arena for this activity was the tilt yard, an open, level space in the castle bailey that was specifically set aside for the practice of arms. Here, the knights and squires would spend several hours each morning engaged in a series of grueling and repetitive physical exercises that were the medieval equivalent of a modern athlete's workout routine. They would practice their swordsmanship, not by fencing with live blades, which were far too valuable and easily damaged for simple practice, but by hacking and thrusting at a wooden post or pell, a training device that was used to develop strength, stamina, and the correct body mechanics for delivering a powerful and effective blow. Another critical training exercise involved the use of the quinton, a target that was designed to simulate an encounter with a mounted opponent. This device typically consisted of a heavy, swiveling crossbar mounted on a post, with a shield at one end and a weighted sandbag at the other. The knight would charge the quinton on his warhorse, attempting to strike the center of the shield with his lance. A successful strike would cause the device to swing away, but a poorly aimed or slow strike would result in the sandbag swinging around and delivering a powerful, punishing blow to the back of the unskillful rider, a painful and embarrassing lesson in the importance of speed and accuracy. The mastery of the warhorse, or destrier, a massive and highly trained animal that was the knight's primary weapon system, was the most important and time-consuming aspect of his training. A significant portion of each day was spent in the saddle, practicing the complex and demanding maneuvers of medieval horsemanship, learning to control the powerful animal with subtle shifts in weight and pressure from the legs, all while encumbered by the weight of his armor and carrying a lance and shield. This constant and repetitive training was not an optional activity but a professional necessity, as a knight's physical strength, his skill with his weapons, and his mastery of his horse were the very foundations of his social identity and his military utility. The afternoons might be devoted to less physically demanding but equally important pursuits, such as the maintenance of his complex and expensive panoply of arms and armor, a time-consuming process of cleaning, oiling, and repairing the intricate system of leather straps and metal plates that constituted his personal defensive system. He might also participate in the hunt, an activity that was both a popular form of aristocratic leisure and a valuable form of military training, honing the skills of tracking, horsemanship, and the use of weapons in a dynamic and unpredictable environment. The evenings were spent in the communal and largely inactive environment of the Great Hall, a long and often tedious period of waiting, with the primary diversions being the playing of board games such as chess or backgammon, listening to the songs and stories of a visiting minstrel, or simply engaging in the endless and often ritualized conversation of the martial household. This highly structured and deeply monotonous routine, which varied little from one day to the next, was the price of the knight's professional status, a life of constant and disciplined preparation for the rare and terrifying moments of real combat that were the ultimate and brutal justification for his existence. The complex and burdensome panoply of arms and armor that was the defining professional accoutrement of the knightly class was not a uniform, but was rather a highly personalized, astronomically expensive and constantly evolving technological system, the possession and maintenance of which was a central and all-consuming preoccupation of the warrior's life. The popular image of the knight as a gleaming, silver-clad figure, encased in a perfectly articulated suit of plate armor, is an anachronistic compression of a long and complex process of technological development, a vision that is truly representative only of the very latest and most decadent phase of the medieval period. For the vast majority of the era, the knight's defensive system was a more composite, less complete, and in many ways more burdensome assemblage of different materials, a layered and often cumbersome defense that was the product of a continuous and incremental arms race between the makers of armor and the developers of ever more powerful and effective weapons. The foundation of this defensive system for much of the central medieval period was the hauberk, a long shirt of mail armor, often reaching to the knees with long sleeves and an integrated coif or hood that covered the head and neck. This mail was not the simple butted ring mail of fantasy and film, but was a sophisticated and incredibly labor-intensive textile of interlinked iron rings, with each individual ring being riveted or welded closed to create a strong, flexible, and continuous mesh that was highly effective at resisting the cutting and slashing blows of a sword or an axe. The creation of a single mail shirt was a monumental undertaking, requiring a master armorer and his apprentices many months of painstaking work to draw the iron wire, form it into rings, and then meticulously link and rivet the thousands, and sometimes tens of thousands of individual rings that made up the finished garment. The result was an item of immense value, a piece of military hardware that was often worth more than a small farm, its cost placing it far beyond the means of anyone but the most prosperous members of the landed aristocracy. While highly effective against cutting weapons, mail was a less adequate defense against the concussive force of a blunt weapon, such as a mace or a war hammer, and it was particularly vulnerable to the piercing thrust of a spear or the point of a well-aimed arrow or crossbow bolt. To supplement the protection offered by the mail, the knight wore a thick, padded undergarment known as an acqueton or gambeson, a quilted jacket made from multiple layers of linen or canvas stuffed with raw wool or horsehair. This garment, which was worn directly under the mail hauberk, was a critical component of the system, as its thick, shock-absorbing layers helped to cushion the body from the blunt force trauma of blows that the mail itself could not stop, and it also provided a degree of protection against the chafing and abrasion that would otherwise be caused by the heavy, rough mesh of the mail. As the period progressed and weapons technology, particularly the development of the powerful crossbow, continued to improve, additional elements of rigid, plate armor were gradually added to this flexible mail and textile foundation to provide extra protection for the most vulnerable areas of the body. Small, plate-like reinforcements such as polions for the knees and couters for the elbows were among the first such additions, followed by the development of greaves to protect the shins and, eventually, a solid breastplate to protect the chest, a piece of equipment that was often worn over the mail hauberk. This gradual and accretive process of development eventually led, by the end of the 15th century, to the creation of the full articulated suit of plate armor, but for most of the medieval period, the knight's defense was this more hybrid and less complete system. The sheer weight of this entire assemblage was a significant and ever-present burden, with a full set of mail and its associated padding weighing 50 pounds or more, a dead weight that was borne almost entirely on the shoulders and which severely restricted the wearer's mobility and taxed his endurance, a factor that made the simple act of walking, let alone fighting, a strenuous and exhausting physical effort. The process of arming a knight for battle was a slow and complex ritual, requiring the assistance of at least one and often two squires, a carefully choreographed sequence of tying, buckling, and lacing the various components of the system together into a functional and secure whole, a process that could take the better part of an hour to complete. The offensive weaponry that the knight was trained to wield was a small and highly specialized toolkit of brutally effective instruments, each designed to defeat a specific type of armor and to function in a particular tactical context, whether on horseback or on foot. The most prestigious and symbolically important of these weapons was the sword, a double-edged cutting and thrusting weapon that was not only a primary instrument of combat but was also the defining emblem of the knight's noble status and his personal honor. The medieval arming sword was a carefully engineered and finely balanced weapon, the product of a master smith's skill, with a blade of high-quality steel that was designed to be both hard enough to hold a sharp edge and flexible enough to withstand the severe impacts of combat without breaking. In the hands of a skilled user, the sword was a versatile and deadly weapon, capable of delivering a powerful shearing cut that could sever a limb or cut through a mail coif, or a precise and lethal thrust that could be aimed at the small gaps in an opponent's armor, such as the armpit or the visor of a helmet. The primary weapon of the mounted knight, however, and the one that defined his tactical role on the battlefield, was the lance, a long, heavy spear, typically 10 to 12 feet in length, that was designed specifically for use from the back of a charging warhorse. The lance was not a throwing weapon, but was instead couched under the arm and aimed at a target. Its effectiveness derived from the principle of concentrating the entire kinetic energy of the charging horse and its heavily armored rider onto the single, small and sharpened point of the lance head. The impact of a successful lance strike was immense, an unstoppable force that could penetrate any form of armor available for much of the period and which was capable of unhorsing an opponent and inflicting a devastating and often instantly lethal wound. The third major component of the knight's arsenal was a selection of blunt force and piercing weapons that were designed specifically to defeat the increasingly effective plate armor of the later medieval period. As armor improved, the effectiveness of the cutting sword diminished, and weapons that relied on concussive force or focused piercing power became more prominent. The mace, a weapon consisting of a heavy, flanged or knobbed head of iron or steel on a short, stout wooden or metal shaft, was a brutally simple and effective tool for delivering a crushing, bone-shattering blow that could incapacitate an armored opponent through sheer blunt force trauma, even without breaching the armor itself. The warhammer was a more specialized variant of this concept, with one side of its head being a heavy, blunt hammer face and the other being a sharp, curved spike or fluke, which was designed to pierce a helmet or a breastplate with a focused, armor-piercing strike. The poleaxe was a more versatile staff weapon, designed for use on foot, which combined the armor-piercing spike of the warhammer with the chopping blade of an axe and the long reach of a spear, a multi-purpose infantry weapon that was one of the most effective and widely used tools for dismounted combat between heavily armored men. This entire system of arms and armor represented a massive personal and financial investment on the part of the knight, a collection of high-technology hardware that required constant maintenance, repair and periodic upgrading to remain effective. The cleaning of the armor to prevent rust, the sharpening of the sword's edge, and the repair of the complex system of leather and rivets was a constant and time-consuming set of chores, another layer of the monotonous and unglamorous labor that underpinned the seemingly glorious and heroic reality of the knight's professional life. The psychological conditioning of the individual who was destined to become a knight began in early childhood, a long, slow, and systematic process of acculturation that was designed to instill the specific set of values, behaviors, and emotional responses that were deemed essential for the fulfillment of his designated role within the martial aristocracy. This was not a formal academic education in the modern sense, but was a deeply immersive and intensely practical apprenticeship in the art of being noble, a curriculum that was delivered not in a classroom but in the bustling, competitive, and often harsh environment of another lord's castle. At the age of around 7, a boy born into the noble class would typically be sent away from his own family to serve as a page in the household of a powerful relative or his father's feudal overlord, a practice known as fosterage that was a fundamental and near-universal feature of aristocratic life. This early separation from his immediate family was a deliberate and socially engineered act, intended to break the bonds of filial affection and to replace them with a new and more important set of loyalties, those owed to his new lord and to the broader, transnational community of the knightly class. The life of a page was one of service and observation. He was assigned to the service of the lady of the castle, where he would learn the basic principles of courtly etiquette, how to serve at table, how to care for clothing and other fine goods, and from the castle's chaplain, the rudiments of the Christian faith and in some cases the basics of literacy. More importantly, however, he was a constant, silent observer of the complex social dynamics of the noble household, learning by watching the intricate rituals of power, the subtle negotiations of status, and the formal and informal codes of conduct that governed every interaction. At the age of around 14, having successfully navigated the probationary period of his pagehood, the boy would graduate to the rank of squire, a transition that marked his formal entry into the world of men and the beginning of his specialized, hands-on training for the profession of arms. As a squire, he was removed from the domestic sphere of the lady and was assigned to the personal service of an individual household knight, a master to whom he owed an absolute and unquestioning obedience. The life of a squire was one of relentless and often grueling labor, a constant and monotonous routine of tasks that were all directly related to the maintenance of the knightly enterprise. He was responsible for the care of his master's most valuable and essential assets: his war horses and his armor. He would spend a significant portion of each day in the stables, grooming and feeding the massive, powerful and often ill-tempered destriers, and in the armory, where he would be tasked with the laborious and never-ending work of cleaning, polishing, and repairing his knight's complex and rust-prone panoply of mail, leather, and plate. He accompanied his master in his daily training exercises in the tilt-yard, assisting him in arming, caring for his weapons, and often serving as a human practice target for certain less dangerous drills. He waited on his master at the high table in the great hall, serving his food and drink and attending to his every need, and he slept on the floor at the foot of his master's bed or sleeping space, a constant and vigilant presence. The most critical phase of his education, however, came when he accompanied his knight into a real battle or a tournament. In this terrifying and chaotic environment, the squire's role was one of direct, close support. He would follow his master into the fray, leading a spare horse, carrying his extra lances, and standing ready to provide assistance if his knight was unhorsed or wounded, a role that exposed him to all of the dangers of combat without affording him the opportunity for personal glory. This long 7 to 10 year apprenticeship was a period of intense and unforgiving social and physical conditioning, a trial by ordeal that was designed to systematically strip away the softness of childhood and to replace it with the hardened, disciplined, and uncomplaining stoicism that was the hallmark of the ideal knight. The culmination of this long and arduous period of training was the knighting ceremony, a solemn and highly ritualized rite of passage that marked the squire's formal transition into the adult world and his official acceptance into the exclusive and prestigious brotherhood of the chivalric order. This was not merely a promotion or a graduation, but was a profound and transformative event, a kind of secular sacrament that was believed to fundamentally alter the social and even the spiritual identity of the individual. The ceremony itself was a complex and deeply symbolic piece of theater, a public performance that was typically staged on a major religious feast day, such as Easter or Pentecost, or on the eve of a major battle or tournament, an occasion that served to heighten its drama and significance. The process began on the night before the ceremony, with a ritual of purification. The squire would take a ceremonial bath, an act that symbolized the washing away of his past and the cleansing of his soul in preparation for the sacred duties he was about to assume. After the bath, he would be dressed in a simple white tunic, symbolizing his purity, and a red robe, symbolizing his willingness to shed his blood in the service of his Lord and his faith. He would then proceed to the castle chapel, where he would spend the entire night in a vigil of prayer, kneeling or standing before the altar, upon which his new sword and armor had been laid to be blessed by the priest. This long, silent, and solitary ordeal was a period of intense spiritual and psychological preparation, a final test of his endurance and his devotion. On the morning of the ceremony, the squire, often exhausted but spiritually fortified by his long vigil, would be led into the great hall or the castle courtyard, which would be filled with the assembled members of the noble household and any visiting dignitaries. He would be formally presented to the lord who was to knight him, and he would swear a series of solemn oaths, pledging his unwavering loyalty to his lord, his devotion to the church, his commitment to protect the weak and the defenseless, and his adherence to the complex and often contradictory tenets of the chivalric code. The central and defining moment of the ceremony was the act of the accolade. The squire would kneel before the lord, who would then administer a symbolic blow, known as the kali, which could take the form of a light tap on the neck or shoulder with the flat of the sword, or, in earlier and more robust traditions, a hearty and not-so-symbolic open-handed slap to the face, a final, memorable reminder of the physical hardships of the life he was entering and a symbolic test of his stoicism. After receiving this blow, the lord would declare him a knight, and his new spurs, a key symbol of his equestrian status, would be strapped to his heels, and his newly consecrated sword would be girded around his waist. The ceremony would conclude with a great feast and often a tournament, a public celebration of the new knight's entry into the ranks of the martial elite. This elaborate and deeply serious ritual was a powerful instrument of social cohesion, a process that transformed a young man from a mere individual into a member of a corporate body, binding him through a series of sacred and public oaths to a strict code of conduct and a lifetime of service to a hierarchical social and political order. The medical knowledge and practices available to the inhabitants of the castle, including the knight who was professionally engaged in the business of inflicting and receiving physical trauma, were a complex and often contradictory amalgam of classical theory, Christian faith, and deeply ingrained folk traditions, a system that, while rational within its own intellectual framework, was almost entirely devoid of the empirical and scientific principles that underpin modern medicine. The theoretical foundation of elite, formally educated medical practice was the ancient Greek theory of the four humors, a complex and intellectually elegant system that had been transmitted to the medieval world through the preserved writings of classical authors like Hippocrates and Galen. This theory posed that the human body was composed of four fundamental fluids or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that a state of good health was the result of a perfect balance among these four substances. Conversely, it was believed that all illness and disease were the result of an imbalance, or dyscrasia, in which one or more of the humors was present in an excessive or deficient quantity. The role of the physician, who was a rare and exceptionally learned individual, typically a cleric who had received his training in a monastic or cathedral school, was not to cure a specific disease in the modern sense, but was to act as a kind of manager of the patient's humoral ecosystem, a learned advisor who sought to restore the body's natural equilibrium through a variety of interventions that were designed to remove the excess humor or to supplement the deficient one. The primary diagnostic tool used by the medieval physician was the visual inspection of the patient's urine, a practice known as uroscopy, which was elevated to the level of a complex and arcane science. The physician would carefully examine a sample of the patient's urine in a special glass flask, noting its color, its clarity, and the nature of any sediment it contained, and from these observations he would make a series of detailed and often remarkably specific deductions about the nature of the patient's humoral imbalance. The therapeutic interventions that followed from this diagnosis were all based on the same underlying principle of rebalancing the humors. The most common and universally applied of all medical treatments was bloodletting or phlebotomy, a procedure that was performed to address any condition that was believed to be caused by an excess of blood, which was the hot and moist humor. This could be done either by making a small incision in a vein, typically in the arm, and allowing a prescribed amount of blood to drain into a bowl, or by the application of leeches to the skin, which were believed to serve the same purpose. Another common set of treatments involved the administration of emetics and purgatives, substances that were designed to induce vomiting or diarrhea, which were believed to be effective methods for purging the body of an excess of yellow or black bile. The specific remedies used were drawn from a vast and complex pharmacopoeia of herbal and mineral substances, the properties of which were also understood through the lens of humoral theory, with each plant and mineral being assigned its own qualities of hot, cold, wet, or dry. The treatment of the physical injuries that were the common and expected consequence of a knight's profession, such as cuts, bruises, and fractures, was a more pragmatic and hands-on affair, a field that was often the province not of the university-trained physician but of the more practical and less theoretical surgeon or barber surgeon. The cleaning and dressing of wounds was a primary concern, and while the concept of antiseptic procedure was entirely unknown, there was a practical understanding of the importance of cleanliness, with wounds often being washed with wine, which had a mild antiseptic effect due to its alcohol content, before being stitched closed with a needle and thread and covered with a clean linen bandage. The setting of a broken bone was done by a process of manual manipulation, with the surgeon using his hands to force the fractured ends of the bone back into their correct alignment before immobilizing the limb with a set of wooden splints and linen bandages, a procedure that, while excruciatingly painful for the patient in the absence of any effective anesthetic, could be remarkably successful if performed by a skilled practitioner. The experience of illness or serious injury within the castle was a profoundly communal and public affair, a condition that was not managed in the sterile and isolated environment of a hospital, but in the midst of the bustling, noisy, and deeply unsanitary world of the Great Hall or the Solar. There was no concept of quarantining the sick to prevent the spread of contagious disease, and an individual suffering from a fever or a respiratory infection would simply remain on his sleeping pallet in the same communal space as his healthy companions, a practice that ensured the rapid and efficient transmission of any communicable illness throughout the entire household. The care of the sick and injured was not the responsibility of a professional nursing staff, but was one of the many domestic duties that fell to the women of the household, from the lady of the castle, who was expected to have a working knowledge of herbal remedies and basic first aid, down to the lowest-ranking female servants. The spiritual dimension of healing was considered to be at least as important, and often more so, than the physical one. Illness was frequently interpreted as a form of divine punishment for sin or as the result of a malevolent supernatural influence, such as a curse or demonic possession, and the primary response to any serious affliction was therefore a spiritual one. The castle chaplain would be summoned to the bedside of the sick or injured person to hear his confession, to administer the sacrament of extreme unction, and to lead the household in prayers for his recovery. The patient might also be encouraged to make a vow to a particular saint, promising to undertake a pilgrimage to their shrine or to make a significant donation to the church in exchange for their divine intercession and a miraculous cure. The line between the physical and the spiritual, between medicine and magic, was a blurry and often non-existent one. Amulets and talismans, inscribed with religious symbols or magical phrases, were commonly worn to ward off disease, and the herbal remedies prepared by the women of the household were often administered in conjunction with the recitation of specific charms or prayers that were believed to enhance their potency. This deeply intertwined system of humoral theory, practical first aid, and religious faith was the complex and multifaceted reality of medieval healthcare, a world in which the fate of the sick or injured knight was ultimately dependent on a combination of his own physical constitution, the rudimentary skills of the surgeon, and the inscrutable will of God. The economic engine that sustained the immense and unceasingly consumptive enterprise of the medieval castle was a complex and deeply entrenched system of agricultural exploitation known as manorialism, a set of social and economic relationships that bound a large, unfree peasant population to the land and systematically siphoned the surplus of their labor upward to support the non-productive, martial aristocracy that resided within the castle's walls. The castle was not an independent entity, but was the administrative and military nerve center of a vast agricultural domain, the manor, which might encompass one or more villages and the thousands of acres of arable land, pasture, and woodland that surrounded them. The entire legal and economic framework of this system was predicated on a fundamental and unbridgeable division of the population into two distinct classes: the small, elite group of lords and warriors who held the land by military and hereditary right, and the vast majority of the populace, the serfs, who worked the land and were legally tied to it in a condition of hereditary bondage. The serf was not a slave in the classical sense, as he could not be bought and sold as an individual piece of property, but his freedom was profoundly and legally circumscribed. He was an inseparable part of the manor itself, a human asset that was transferred along with the land whenever the manor changed hands, and he was forbidden by law from leaving the land to which he was bound without the express permission of his lord, a permission that was rarely, if ever, granted. The physical landscape of the manor was typically organized around a system of open-field agriculture, in which the arable land was divided into several vast, unenclosed fields. A portion of this land, often the most fertile and productive part, was designated as the lord's domain, the private land of the lord, which was cultivated directly for his benefit and for the provisioning of his castle household. The remainder of the land was divided into a large number of small, scattered strips that were allocated to the peasant households for their own subsistence. In exchange for the right to cultivate these strips of land and to build their humble dwellings in the village, the serfs owed their lord a complex and burdensome array of dues and obligations. The most significant of these was the labor service, a requirement that each adult male serf devote a specified number of days each week, typically 2 or 3, to working on the lord's domain, a form of unpaid labor that constituted a massive and direct transfer of energy from the peasant to the lord. All of the work of plowing, sowing, weeding, and harvesting the Lord's fields was performed by this compulsory, uncompensated labor force, and the entire product of the domain, every sheaf of wheat, every bushel of barley, was transported to and stored within the castle's granaries for the exclusive use of the Lord and his household. In addition to this weekly labor service, the serfs were also required to perform extra duties, known as boon work, during the peak periods of the agricultural calendar, such as the harvest and the haymaking, times when the demand for labor was at its most intense. Beyond this direct appropriation of their time and energy, the serfs were also required to pay a portion of the produce from their own small landholdings to the Lord, a tax in kind known as a tithe, which typically amounted to 1/10 of their annual harvest. Furthermore, the Lord exercised a series of monopolies over the essential infrastructure of the manor, known as banalities, which forced the peasants to use the Lord's mill to grind their grain, his oven to bake their bread, and his winepress to make their wine, and for each of these services, they were required to pay a fee, another small but constant drain on their meager resources. This relentless and multifaceted system of extraction was the economic foundation upon which the entire edifice of the castle and the knightly lifestyle was built, a structure that was, in essence, a highly efficient and legally sanctioned mechanism for converting the sweat and toil of a subjugated rural population into the food, the fuel, and the financial resources that were necessary to sustain a specialized, non-productive military class. The life of the serf within this manorial system was one of almost unimaginable and unceasing labor, a daily and seasonal struggle for subsistence that was lived out at the absolute margin of survival. The peasant village, typically a small and crowded cluster of wattle and daub huts with thatched roofs, was a world away from the massive stone permanence of the Lord's castle, which loomed on the horizon as a constant and intimidating symbol of the power that governed every aspect of their lives. The peasant's dwelling was a simple one-room structure, often shared with the family's few domestic animals, a space that was dark, smoky, and devoid of any but the most rudimentary of furnishings. The daily diet was a monotonous and often nutritionally inadequate one, based almost entirely on the pottage of dark bread and thin vegetable gruel that could be produced from their own small strips of land, a diet that was dangerously dependent on the success of a single annual harvest and was therefore acutely vulnerable to the unpredictable and often devastating effects of drought, flood, or pestilence. The work in the fields was performed with a technology that had remained largely unchanged for centuries, a reliance on the heavy ox-drawn plow and the simple hand tools of the scythe and the sickle, a form of labor that was intensely physical, deeply repetitive, and which occupied the daylight hours of every member of the peasant family, from the youngest child, who was tasked with scaring birds away from the newly sown fields, to the oldest and most infirm, who would perform what light tasks they could around the household. The relationship between the peasant and the knight was one of profound and unbridgeable distance, a relationship between two worlds that were geographically close but socially separated by a vast and impassable gulf. The peasant viewed the knight not as a noble protector or a romantic hero, but as the direct and often brutal instrument of the Lord's extractive power, the armed and mounted enforcer who was responsible for collecting the taxes, enforcing the labor services, and punishing any act of defiance or resistance. The knight, in turn, viewed the peasantry not as his fellow countrymen or even as fully human individuals, but as a subordinate and almost subhuman class, a resource to be managed and exploited, an attitude that was deeply ingrained in the aristocratic culture and was reinforced by a social and legal system that stripped the serf of any meaningful rights or personal agency. This profound and mutually reinforcing system of economic exploitation and social contempt was the grim and unwritten reality that underpinned the glittering facade of the chivalric age, a world in which the magnificent stone castle and the heavily armored knight were the direct and ultimate products of the relentless and uncompensated labor of a vast and subjugated peasant population. The eventual and protracted decline of the castle as the supreme instrument of military power and the central organizing principle of society was not the result of a single technological breakthrough or a decisive historical event, but was a slow, complex, and uneven process of erosion, a gradual obsolescence that was driven by a confluence of fundamental and interconnected changes in the nature of warfare, the structure of political power, and the underlying economic foundations of the feudal world. The first and most tangible of the forces that began to undermine the castle's military dominance was the development and proliferation of effective gunpowder artillery. The early cannons of the 14th and 15th centuries were crude, unreliable, and immensely cumbersome weapons, capable of firing irregularly shaped stone or iron projectiles with a very low degree of accuracy, and they were initially more effective as psychological weapons than as practical siege engines. However, as the science of metallurgy and the art of the gunpowder continued to advance, these primitive bombards evolved into more powerful, more mobile, and more reliable siege cannons, weapons that were capable of hurling massive iron cannonballs with enough force to systematically batter and eventually breach even the most formidable of the traditional high-walled stone fortifications. The age-old dynamic of siege warfare, which had for centuries favored the defender, who could sit securely behind his thick stone walls and wait for the attacker to be defeated by starvation or disease, was now fundamentally and irrevocably altered. A well-equipped besieging army, possessing a train of heavy siege artillery, could now bring a castle to a state of crisis in a matter of weeks or even days, rather than the months or years that had been required by the older technologies of the trebuchet and the battering ram. The response of the castle builders to this new and existential threat was a period of frantic architectural innovation, a final, dramatic phase in the evolution of the fortress in which the tall, proud towers and thin, high curtain walls of the classic medieval castle were replaced by a new style of fortification that was low-slung, massively thick and geometrically complex, with angled bastions and projecting earthworks that were designed specifically to absorb the impact of cannon fire and to provide stable, protected platforms for the defender's own artillery. This new style of artillery fort, however, was an astronomically expensive and highly specialized form of military architecture, a type of fortress that was far beyond the financial means of all but the most powerful of the emerging national monarchs, and its development signaled the end of the era in which the private, semi-autonomous castle of the local feudal lord could serve as a credible and independent center of military power. This technological shift was both a cause and a consequence of a much broader and more profound political transformation, the slow and often violent decline of the decentralized, fragmented power structure of feudalism and the gradual rise of the centralized, bureaucratic and absolutist nation-state. The feudal system, with its complex and overlapping web of personal loyalties and its diffusion of military power among a large and often fractious class of semi-independent nobles, was an inherently unstable and inefficient model for governing a large territory. The new generation of ambitious and forward-thinking monarchs who came to power in the late medieval and early modern periods sought to consolidate their authority by systematically dismantling this old feudal order, a process that involved disarming the nobility, destroying their private castles, and asserting the absolute and unrivaled monopoly of the state over the legitimate use of organized violence. The new and prohibitively expensive technology of gunpowder artillery became a powerful and indispensable tool in this process of state building, as it gave the king a decisive military advantage over any rebellious or recalcitrant nobleman. A feudal lord, secure in his ancestral stone castle, might once have been able to defy his king with impunity, but he could no longer resist the overwhelming power of the royal siege train. The castle, which had once been the ultimate symbol and guarantor of the nobleman's independence, was now rendered a tactical and political liability, a fortress that could no longer protect him from the wrath of a determined and well-equipped sovereign. As the power of the central state grew, the private armies of the feudal lords were gradually replaced by the standing, professional armies of the king, and the knight, the independent, landholding heavy cavalryman, was slowly superseded as the decisive force on the battlefield by the disciplined and drilled infantry formations of the new era, armed with pikes and firearms, and by the professional, state-controlled artillery corps. The old feudal contract in which the knight held his land in exchange for military service, was slowly rendered obsolete, its military function being replaced by a more direct and impersonal system of royal taxation, which was used to fund the new, centralized military machine of the state. As the castle's military and political functions continued to decline, its role as a high-status aristocratic residence also began to be challenged by new and more comfortable models of domestic architecture. The very features that had made the castle an effective fortress. Its thick, dark walls, its small, narrow windows and its cramped, defensible layout, made it an increasingly undesirable and unfashionable place to live for a new generation of aristocrats who were more concerned with the performance of courtly sophistication and the enjoyment of a comfortable and luxurious lifestyle than they were with the grim and constant threat of a military siege. The focus of elite architectural ambition shifted away from the fortified and vertical keep and towards the unfortified, sprawling and light-filled country house or the elegant urban palace, structures that were designed not for defense but for the conspicuous display of wealth, taste and political influence. The Great Hall, the dark and noisy communal heart of the medieval castle, was gradually replaced by a more complex and specialized suite of domestic spaces, with separate dining rooms, private parlors, and long galleries that were designed to display collections of art and to provide a venue for elegant social promenades. The old, drafty, and uncomfortable castles of their ancestors were increasingly abandoned by the great noble families in favor of these new, more comfortable and more fashionable residences, or they were subjected to a series of drastic and often incongruous renovations that sought to impose the new ideals of light, space, and symmetry onto the old, recalcitrant fabric of the medieval fortress, a process that often involved the punching of large, symmetrical sash windows through the thick stone walls and the gutting of the original labyrinthine interiors. Many of the castles that were not fortunate enough to be so upgraded simply fell into a state of slow and picturesque decay, their military and political purpose having been completely extinguished, their walls stripped of their valuable lead and timber, and their stones being carted away by the local population to be reused in the construction of more humble and more practical buildings. The castle, which had for centuries been the powerful and intimidating engine of the medieval world, was thus transformed into a relic, a romantic and often misunderstood symbol of a past and brutal age, its crumbling ruins a silent and melancholic testament to the profound and irreversible historical forces that had rendered it, and the entire social and political world that it had once sustained, completely and utterly obsolete. As the weight of sleep slowly closes your eyelids, let your imagination wander through the ages in your dreams. If you enjoyed the video, I invite you to like it. There are more boring history stories to help you fall asleep. See you at bedtime. Goodbye.